Okay, if you've ever wondered what it truly means to be trapped, like right between a colonial power and your own conscience, well, this is the deep dive for you today.
Got it.
We're heading into really one of the most painful, often suppressed corners of World War II history.
Hmm.
We're talking about the experience of conscripted Taiwanese youth. Young men forced to serve the Japanese military in the incredibly harsh Southeast Asian theater, specifically Borneo.
It's such a critical story, and the sources we're looking at today, historical documents, but also insights from the film The Sound of the Sea, they really highlight this excruciating moral paradox.
Paradox is the right word.
Yeah, because these young men, they were absolutely victims of Japanese colonial oppression. But then,
But then their assignments, right?
exactly, the cruel nature of their assignments forced them into this role of, well, passive perpetrators
Yeah.
over Allied prisoners of war.
And that dual role, that's the absolute core of the tension here, isn't it?
It is.
The second they put on that uniform, they were basically inhabiting this morally compromised space. It wasn't just military history. It was the ultimate ethical dilemma forced onto them.
So our mission today is really to unpack all of this. We need to look at the historical backdrop, the extreme suffering in Borneo,
Right.
then the ethical layers of the conscription itself, the very personal struggles of three specific figures we'll focus on,
Okay.
and ultimately what that burden, that weight of institutionalized obedience really cost them.
All right, let's set the scene a bit more. The geography of suffering, as you put it. We're talking Borneo, so modern-day Sarawak and Sabah in Malaysia. What was Japan actually aiming for there, and what made it so uniquely, unbelievably awful between, say, 1941 and 45?
Well, the primary Japanese goal in Borneo was strategic necessity. It was about resources.
Oil.
Oil, absolutely. The Japanese war machine was desperate for it. But the environment itself, that was the first and maybe the most relentless enemy for everyone there.
So not just bullets and bombs.
Oh, far from it. Forget battle wounds for a moment. The conscripted troops, the laborers, including thousands of Taiwanese, they walked into a hellscape. We're talking rampant, deadly malaria, dysentery, crushing humidity, and just near constant crippling food shortages.
The sources make it sound like the attrition rate from just illness was devastating, like before any combat even happened for many.
That's exactly right. Survival was incredibly difficult, even for the soldiers fighting. But for the prisoners, it was near impossible.
And this speaks to the Japanese military's conduct in that theater, doesn't it? It sounds like a total collapse of any kind of humane warfare standard.
It really does. The sources often point to the 1945 Sandakan Death March as, well, a horrific measure of this brutality.
Okay, pause there. For listeners who might not know the specifics of Sandakan, what made that so chilling? What does it tell us about the lack of human rights?
The numbers are just stark. You have roughly 2,400 Australian and British POWs. They're forced on this march from Sandakan to Rano under the absolute worst conditions imaginable. Extreme duress.
And the outcome?
At the end of it all, only 6 people survived. And they only survived because they managed to escape.
6 out of 2,400.
6. The Japanese strategy often boiled down to simply reducing the number of prisoners through forced starvation, untreated illness, these impossible marches.
And if we connect that level of systemic cruelty to the bigger picture, it just highlights the complete abandonment of any global standard at the time, right? Like the Geneva Conventions.
Completely. The 1929 Geneva Conventions specifically prohibited torture, cruel, or degrading treatment of POWs.
But here,
Those rules were basically ignored. Prisoners were treated as less than human. And that systemic top-down disregard for life, that's what created the poisonous environment that the Taiwanese conscripts were then forced into.
they were basically fed into a machine that had already defined cruelty as necessity.
Precisely.
Oh, okay, so let's pivot now to those Taiwanese conscripts themselves. We've established they were victims of colonialism, yes, but they were also, by their appointment, part of this machinery. What kinds of roles put them in this impossible situation?
Well, their roles were surprisingly central in some cases and quite varied. Yes, many were laborers, building airstrips, clearing jungle roads, grueling work.
Sure.
But many others were actually elevated to administrative or supervisory positions, things like transport commanders, interpreters, and maybe most crucially, prison camp supervisors or management officers.
Wow. So they were overseeing not just Allied POWs, but sometimes lower-ranking Taiwanese laborers, too.
That's right, which created another layer of complexity and tension.
And here's something that feels counterintuitive from the sources. It wasn't just the poor or, lowest social ranks filling these difficult supervisor roles. It seems wealthier, more educated youth were sometimes easier targets for these specific positions. Why? How does that work?
It really speaks directly to the insidious nature of that colonial mindset. To be useful in those roles, you needed certain skills, cultural access, linguistic access.
Like speaking Japanese.
Exactly. These more educated youths often had near-native Japanese language proficiency because of the Japanese education system imposed in Taiwan. But it went beyond just skills. There was also this intense pressure of family honor.
Ah, the idea of serving the empire to gain some kind of social standing? Or maybe just to show loyalty.
Precisely. For a certain segment of the educated Taiwanese elite, service, even in this context, seemed to offer a potential path, maybe the only path, to upward mobility and acceptance, the very things colonialism otherwise denied them.
So they sought validation within the Japanese structure.
But that very act, seeking acceptance, immediately forced them into these deep moral compromises. It set them up perfectly to enforce the rules of a system that deep down still viewed them as inferior. And that just made their psychological burden so much heavier than, say, a simple laborer just trying to survive day to day.
Right. They were expected to be loyal servants, translate the orders, supervise, placing them squarely in the middle. They're enforcing Japanese demands onto Allied prisoners and sometimes even onto their own Taiwanese compatriots.
It's a classic double bind. They had to uphold the structure of the system while simultaneously being victims of its underlying colonial racism.
Trapped.
And that structural reality, that trap, it's probably best understood through individual stories, right?
Yeah.
Let's zoom in on how this actually played out for real people. The sources highlight 3 specific figures who seem to illustrate this spectrum of moral conflict really well.
Yeah. Let's start with Shinhai Chiwan. The sources paint him as highly educated, fluent in Japanese, coming from a relatively high-status background.
Okay.
And his primary role is a POW supervisor. Well, that defines his whole narrative. It's one steeped in deep moral conflict and ultimately overwhelming guilt.
So he kind of represents the emotional collapse of the educated conscience. He understood the language, the orders, the implications.
Exactly. His struggle wasn't just about physical survival. It was about the ethical contamination he felt from having served as an enabler, even passively, of institutional violence.
Right. And then the second figure. Then we have Shin Hai-hui. He actually achieved a higher rank. He became a management officer, supervising other Taiwanese personnel.
So supervising his own people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his conflict was both internal and external. How do you enforce brutal Japanese orders, sometimes against your own compatriots, while grappling with your own identity, your conscience? He really embodies that phrase, youth caught in the middle. He was bearing this immense double pressure, colonial demands on one side, communal responsibility, maybe guilt on the other.
That's incredibly tough. And the third one, Shin Hai-kid.
Shin Hai-kid, also known as Eite, he was more middle-class, average education, conscripted into just basic, base-level duty. His story, his fate, it reveals the tragic lack of choice, the raw oppression faced by grassroots Taiwanese youth.
How so?
He learned very quickly, the sources suggest, that the only way to survive in that brutal hierarchy, to avoid being constantly trampled on by those just slightly above him, Japanese or even other Taiwanese, was to adopt the aggression of his oppressors. He had to become fierce.
Wow. So just to survive, he had to become part of the cruelty.
Kid's story shows how the system's corrosion reached right down to the lowest levels. For the educated, like Chiwan, maybe the corrosion felt primarily ethical, internal. For someone like Kid, it was almost essential for physical survival itself.
And this is where the moral cost becomes truly devastating, isn't it? Especially when we look at what happened after the main campaign, in the aftermath. The sources detail the fates of these men, particularly around the chilling circumstances of executing prisoners.
Yes, the post-war trials brought a lot of this to light, exposing the painful truth about obedience in this system. What's both fascinating and utterly devastating is the revelation about who gave the direct command for certain executions.
It wasn't a high-ranking Japanese officer.
In the specific instance highlighted, the order acted upon came directly from Shin Hai-hui, the Taiwanese squad leader we just discussed. He was following a command passed down the Japanese chain, of course, but he was the one who directly implemented it.
So it wasn't the Japanese general physically standing there with the rifle. It was the man caught right in the middle carrying out the order. How do the sources help us understand that choice? Was it just pure coercion, fear, or something deeper?
The sources strongly suggest it was institutionalized obedience, not personal sadism or cruelty. Ween was acting out the mandate of the very system that had shaped him.
Right.
And they capture his internal rationale, his justification, so powerfully and painfully. He's quoted as saying something like, "I grew up eating Japanese rice, receiving Japanese education.
Wow, that quote, that feels like the deepest shackle of colonialism right there, doesn't it?
It really does.
It wasn't necessarily about being loyal to Japan as a nation, maybe, but loyal to the identity that Japan had forced upon them. Maybe the only path to respect or power they felt they had.
That's exactly how it reads. They knew, fundamentally, they were Taiwanese, but they were sourced to live and act as Japanese, constantly hoping for that acceptance, that chance to rise above their fundamentally subservient colonial status. And that hope became the trap. It forced them into committing unforgivable acts, all in the name of somehow belonging.
But even in that defining moment of compliance, the sources mention a flicker of something else, right? Something with Hui and Chiyuan.
Yes, a moment of profound humanity, almost. Just before Hui himself faced the consequences of his obedience, he was later sentenced to death. He apparently handed Chiyuan, his compatriot, a gun for an execution. But he whispered.
What did he say?
He whispered, "Don't worry, the gun I gave you has no bullets."
Oh my God.
This is an incredible gesture, a desperate last-minute attempt, perhaps, to protect Chiyuan, his sort of brother figure, from committing the ultimate act of perpetration. He couldn't save himself from the system he served, but maybe he tried to save the soul of the man standing next to him.
Which just brings us back to that brutal conclusion. Obedience under an unjust system inevitably leads to complicity. The system forces these impossible choices between loyalty, identity, survival. And the sources argue so powerfully that those who obey these kinds of orders are, in a real sense, as much victims as those who perish.
And that difficult realization leads us straight to the fate of the ultimate survivor in this narrative, Xinhai Qiwan. He wasn't executed. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for, quote, following orders.
Right. And the sources suggest something really profound about that survival, that living, that sentence. It was somehow the heaviest punishment of all. That's a massive statement. Why? Why would survival be worse?
Because he didn't just return to Taiwan physically scarred. He came back burdened by this immense, overwhelming psychological weight, the weight of memory, of guilt, of this unbearable loneliness. He carried the trauma not just of what he endured, but of the crimes committed by the system he was forced to serve. And he was the one left alive to remember it all.
In that kind of war, personal integrity, your soul, that's the first casualty, maybe.
It seems that way. And this pattern, this terrible pattern of forced obedience creating systemic violence, it didn't just stop when the Japanese surrendered. The sources draw a really potent parallel here to a later event in Taiwan itself, the 1947 February 28 incident, often just called the 228 incident.
Okay, for listeners who might not be familiar with 228, how does that connect back to the experience of these men in Borneo?
The connection is that theme of mandated complicity, of being forced to act against conscience. During the 228 incident, when the then-ruling Chinese Nationalist Party suppressed Taiwanese dissent, many of the soldiers carrying out the killings, the arrests, they were also trapped in that logic of merely following orders.
Ah, I see.
So the trauma experienced by the Borneo conscripts being caught between a cruel power structure and their own conscience or community, it was echoed years later. The specific system changed, from Japanese colonialism to KMT rule, but that moral trap remained horribly similar. Obey the orders, commit the violence, often against your own people, or face dire consequences yourself.
It just underlines the eternal hypocrisy of power structures, doesn't it? And this critique is captured so perfectly in that chilling quote attributed to the defeated Japanese commander. Facing trial, he kind of turns it back on the victors, questioning the guilt of Western powers and their own histories of conquest and exploitation, essentially asking,
This is war, isn't it?
Yeah, it's brutal.
It really reveals the cyclical nature of state-sanctioned violence. The brutality of the strong is so often dressed up as justice or necessity or order, while any resistance from the weak gets condemned. So-called civilized nations built empires through conquest, and it was often only after a war was lost that the victors started invoking international law and human rights, frequently while prosecuting individuals who were themselves trapped by the very systems of obedience those powers often rely on.
So this whole deep dive, it really forces us, and you listening, to acknowledge a history, a truth that's been suppressed for a long time, hasn't it? These forgotten Taiwanese lives, lost, damaged, morally compromised in the South Seas, they were caught in this ideological meat grinder that wasn't of their own making at all.
Absolutely. And I think the conclusion we have to draw from these sources is profound. It's that the atrocities of war, the specific acts, they may never truly be forgiven. How could they be? But the memory must be preserved.
Why? Why is remembering so crucial even when it's this painful?
Because remembering, especially remembering the systemic nature of their suffering, transforms that trauma. It shifts it from just individual guilt or shame into a broader moral awareness. And, maybe most importantly, it restores a measure of dignity to those individuals who are forced onto what history later judges the wrong side.
It allows them to be understood not just as perpetrators, but primarily as victims of colonialism first.
Exactly. Victims caught in an impossible situation.
Which leaves you, our listener, with a pretty heavy thought to mull over, doesn't it? If obedience under an unjust system is effectively a form of complicity, where do you draw that line today? In your own life, in society? Where does necessary submission to authority end, and the moral duty to question, maybe even resist, the system begin? Think about the invisible shackles you might still be carrying.
All right, today we're jumping into the incredible film 3 Tears in Borneo. This story uncovers a really painful and often forgotten piece of World War II history. The story of Taiwanese kids who were forced to fight for the Japanese Empire, the very people colonizing them. This isn't just a war story, it's a story about a war within a war. But to really get a sense of the stakes here, let me just start with a number: 6. That's how many Allied prisoners of war managed to survive the horrific Sandakan death march in Borneo. 6 out of nearly 2,400. That one single horrifying fact, well, that sets the stage for the brutal world our characters are about to be thrown into. So, where are we? The film takes place between 1941 and 1945, right in the middle of the Japanese occupation of Borneo. And why were they there? It was all about the oil. Japan needed those resources, which made the island an absolutely critical battleground in the Pacific. Now, for the Taiwanese soldiers and laborers who were shipped over there, the enemy wasn't always a guy with a rifle. Most of the time, their biggest fight was against the jungle itself. I mean, can you imagine building roads and airstrips in that crushing humidity, with malaria spreading like wildfire and barely any food to eat? For so many of them, the war was already lost to disease and starvation long before they ever saw a real battle. And you know, on paper, there were rules. The Geneva Conventions from 1929 clearly stated that prisoners of war had to be treated humanely. But the reality on the ground? Well, it was a complete and utter nightmare. For the Allied POWs, for the local people, and even for the Taiwanese conscripts, those rules might as well have not existed. So you have this absolutely brutal physical environment. But beyond that, the young Taiwanese men were fighting an even tougher battle, and this one was inside their own heads. They were stuck in a painful, impossible position, trapped between their own identity and the orders they were forced to follow. And this really shows you their terrible dilemma. On one hand, they were clearly victims. They were colonized people, forced to fight for an empire that was oppressing them. But on the other hand, they were turned into cogs in the machine. They were ordered to guard Allied POWs and enforce the very system that was stripping them of their own humanity. They were truly youth caught in the middle. Now here's something that might surprise you. Who was often picked for these supervisory jobs? It wasn't the uneducated or the poor. It was often the kids from wealthier, more educated backgrounds. And why is that? Well, they could speak Japanese, which was obviously a huge plus. It also helped project this social image of loyalty to the empire. And sadly, some of them had been so indoctrinated that they actually believed in the glory of it all. The film really dives deep into this massive struggle by following the lives of 3 young Taiwanese men. Their fates are all tangled up, and each one of them represents a totally different side of this tragedy. So let's meet our guys. First, we have Chi Wan. He's the educated one from a rich family, and he is just drowning in guilt. Then there's Hui, who's ambitious, he's getting promoted, and he's in this constant struggle between following orders and listening to his conscience. And finally, you have Mutek. He's just a regular guy, and his struggle is a lot simpler, just trying to survive another day. This line right here, it gets to the absolute heart of Hori's character. See, he came from a poorer background, and he desperately wanted to be accepted by the Japanese. And that's the cruel genius of colonialism, isn't it? It takes a very human desire, the need for recognition, and twists it into a chain that binds you to the very system that's crushing you. And this leads us right into the film's core moral crisis, which is this soul-crushing burden of obedience. We're about to see how these guys try to make choices in situations where, frankly, every single path leads to tragedy. When Hui says this, it is absolutely chilling. You can hear a whole lifetime of indoctrination in that one line. He's trying to justify his actions because he's been taught his whole life to see himself as Japanese. His loyalty wasn't chosen, it was manufactured. But then, just when you think his humanity is totally gone, he whispers this to his friend Chi Yuen. This one little act of defiance, of brotherhood, it shows you that even in the most dehumanizing system imaginable, that little flicker of conscience can somehow survive. It's an incredible contrast. So what this all boils down to is a terrifying concept the film calls institutionalized obedience. It's what happens when the act of just following orders becomes more important than your own moral compass. It's how good people end up becoming part of a violent system, not because they're evil, but because they simply do what they're told. And the results are just devastating. Mu Tae, our everyman, he's just swallowed up by the chaos and killed. Hui, the ambitious one, is executed for following his orders to their terrible conclusion. And Chi Wan, our narrator, he survives, but he's condemned to carry the weight of this horror for the rest of his life. And here is the final, gut-wrenching twist that comes out at the war crimes trial. It was Hui, the squad leader, who gave the fatal command to open fire. It wasn't an act of personal cruelty. It was the ultimate act of a soldier completely trapped by his duty. In that moment, he did what he thought he had to do. So, after witnessing all of this tragedy, the film kind of zooms out and asks, what's the purpose of remembering all this? And it argues that remembering these stories, no matter how painful they are, is an essential way to restore dignity. A Japanese commander says this line in the film, and he's basically questioning why Western countries never felt guilty about their own conquests. Now, it's a cynical thing to say, but it points to a really dark hypocrisy, right? The violence of the powerful is so often just called necessary, while the actions of the weak are called a crime. Ultimately, this film is doing a kind of historical healing. It's finally giving a voice to the tens of thousands of Taiwanese soldiers whose stories were just completely buried after the war. Because they were on the wrong side of history, their families had to live with grief and shame in total silence. Their sacrifices were never even acknowledged. So why does all this remembering matter so much? Because it takes all that suffering and turns it into awareness. It's a refusal to let these people and their stories be erased. It's not about forgiving war. It's about honoring the victims, all of them, and reminding ourselves that peace is an incredibly fragile thing that was earned through unimaginable pain. And so the film leaves us with this really powerful question. By telling these kinds of stories, by facing the uncomfortable truths of the past, a nation can start to understand itself. And maybe, just maybe, it can begin to heal. It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the real human souls who got caught in the current.